Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. We'll just wait a minute or so for you all to join and come into the webinar today. Lots of you coming in thick and fast, so that's great to see. Before we get going and I hand over to Tim, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Julia and I am the Commercial Executive at Sintali. And it's great to have all of you here to learn a bit more about building with nature. So this webinar is in one of the events running as part of Net Zero Week. So this sort of brings together all the minds, all the companies that are working for net zero and all of their initiatives related to reaching that net zero goal. It is only Wednesday, we're halfway through Net Zero Week, so there are plenty other sessions upcoming, and I urge you to have a look on the website and see what else is available, because they've got lots of really great and insightful sessions. Before we get going then, so we do have an opportunity at the end of the webinar to answer questions. So the Q&A box has been enabled, so if you have a question as we go through the slides, please do write it in the Q&A box, and any questions, in the case that we do run out of time, any unanswered questions, we can email you after the session, so do not worry if your question is not answered. This webinar is being recorded and it will be shared by the Net Zero Week team in a couple of days following the webinar, and we will also email the slides out to you following the webinar as well. So I think we can get going. So I'd like to introduce Tim, who is Head of Standards and Operations at Sintali, and he'll be taking you through the Building with Nature ropes today. So I'll hand you over to Tim.
Thanks, Julia. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. So as Julia said, my name's Tim Bevan, and I'm the Head of Standards Operations at Sintali. I think we've got in the region of about 150 people signed up to this webinar, and about a third of you are maybe tuning in from outside the UK, which is great. So welcome everyone, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to hear me speak, particularly if you're tuning in at a rather unsociable hour. I'll do my best to make it worth your while. But before I dive in, for those of you who are not familiar with Sintali, we were founded in 2020 with a mission to drive positive change through verifying the environmental impact of the built environment. And we do that by supporting companies on their sustainability goals in several ways, but primarily through the development and application of best practice standards and the verification of performance of buildings and green infrastructure to those standards. And to date, we've been working in a number of countries with, I think it's over 30 partners and 700 clients. And I think a number of you have probably joined us today. And we've also certified over 9,000 buildings to the EDGE standard, and our certification to the Building with Nature standard, whilst it's slightly less than that, it's growing. And I'm going to obviously talk more about Building with Nature today. But if you're interested in finding out a bit more about what Sintali do, then by all means visit our website, sintali.com. Now, I joined Sintali earlier this year along with the Building with Nature Standards framework, which I've been working on since 2021. I do have a bit of a confession to make. I don't consider myself to be a green infrastructure expert, but I am going to talk a lot today about green infrastructure. And whilst I have a background in building and construction, I've spent the majority of my career developing and applying best practice standards in the fields of sustainability in the built environment. So that's really my area of expertise. So I like to think of myself as a bit of a sustainability jack of all trades, with expertise and experience in standards development and certification. But in the last 3 years, I've been focusing solely on green infrastructure in particular. So I feel I'm sort of rapidly becoming more knowledgeable in this field, if not quite an expert yet. It's Building with Nature and green infrastructure that's the focus of the presentation today. It's also worth noting that Building with Nature was designed for and is currently operated in the UK. So my presentation will have an emphasis in terms of its application in the UK and on UK projects, but many of the themes that I touch on and cover will resonate beyond national boundaries, and I'm sure be recognisable to many of you. Before I dive into the detail of Building with Nature, I wanted to do some sort of scene setting and take a step back and talk about green infrastructure, what it is, why we need it, and how it benefits us. So what is green infrastructure? Well, I'm sure many of you have come across the term before and even been involved in its creation. And like many great ideas, green infrastructure, or GI as we sometimes call it, has been around since at least the time of antiquity and probably since the Neolithic period. It's believed that the first type of green roofs were sod roofs above caves, which were used by our Neolithic ancestors to protect against the elements and to provide shelter and insulation against the elements. And 3,000 years ago, the Shang dynasty in China developed what they call literary gardens. And these provide shade and ecological havens within the cities for the aristocracy to enjoy. And of course, there's the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which are said to have displayed spectacular engineering, including a building with built-in irrigation system. And the ancient Greeks and Romans were also big fans of green walls and roof gardens. Apparently, one emperor declared that at least one plant had to be grown on every roof, as it was believed to protect against lightning strikes and fires. So that's possibly one of the first pieces of green infrastructure planning policy in history. So perhaps not surprisingly, and long before modern planning, design and construction, our ancestors were embracing green infrastructure to provide nature-based solutions to cooling and to water management, heat loss, and building resilience and people's well-being. So the green infrastructure is nothing new. I doubt the ancient Greeks and Romans used the term green infrastructure, but they would probably recognise our modern day definition of it, which I think was born out of a necessity in more recent times to rediscover some of its benefits. And this is one definition that we tend to use to define what green infrastructure is. So we describe GI as the network of natural and semi-natural features, green spaces, rivers and lakes that intersperse and connect villages, towns and cities. And individually, these elements are referred to as GI assets, and the roles that these assets play are GI functions. And when appropriately planned, designed and managed, the assets and the functions have the potential to deliver a wide range of benefits, from things like providing sustainable transport links to mitigating and adapting the effects of climate change. And essentially, we think of green infrastructure as critical infrastructure. It's not simply an alternative description for conventional open space. It's more the window dressing or the garnish for new development. But why do we need green infrastructure? So in answering that question, there are two topics that I want to explore, and they concern people and wildlife. Now, if you're a similar age to me, this image on the screen might be familiar one to you from car journeys as a child. And I can remember traveling down the motorway in midsummer and the car windscreen would get splattered with insects. And sometimes on a particular longer journeys, it was so bad we had to stop the car at the nearest services and wash the screen because we'd run out of windscreen washer. You just couldn't see where you were going half the time. And this was still the case long after I learned to drive. But in the last 10 years in particular, I started to notice that this was no longer a problem when I was driving my car. And I started to wonder why that is. And what was it, because cars had been better designed, or have insects just got clever at avoiding them? And a couple of years ago, I did look into some recent studies on this. And there have been a few studies about this phenomenon in the last decade or so. And I came across one by Kent Wildlife Trust in the UK. And they did a survey in 2019 where they analysed over 650 car journeys between June and August. And they asked drivers to report the number of insects splattered on their car's registration plate. And what they found was that there were 50% fewer insects were splattered compared to 15 years ago. Now, there was a similar study carried out by the RSPB, a conservation charity in the UK in 2004, And the researchers then found that the number of splattered insects had declined by approximately 50%. So you had these two studies, 15 years apart, showing a 50% on 50% reduction. Now, they're obviously only two limited studies, but the findings give a small indication of what is quite a significant problem, and that's the population decline in insects. And recently, this has been given the popular name, the insect apocalypse. And like most apocalypses, its impact could be significant if nothing is done about it. And the decline of insects is also a small example of what academics and environmentalists call shifting baseline syndrome. And this is caused by younger generations failing to notice environmental decline because that decline has downgraded the baseline to a new normal. So today it's normal not to notice insects splattered on your windscreen as much because there are fewer of them. And if with every new generation there's less nature to experience, then not only does it contribute to vital knowledge being lost, but people will generally become less inspired by the natural world, and therefore be even less likely to want to restore or care for what's left. So that's a quite a sad picture of nature declining. But what's causing some of that decline? So in terms of the UK, we're a small country, and we're one of the first, obviously, to embark on the Industrial Revolution. So we have a long history of land change and land management, and we can see some of the results of that. So we're in some senses in the vanguard of this challenge. And in the last 50 years, in the UK, much of the wildlife-rich habitat that we did have has been lost, or it's been degraded. And our country is sadly now one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. It's in the bottom 10% of all countries in terms of its intact biodiversity. And that trend is continuing, and it's obviously a result of things like urbanization, of agriculture, deforestation, and also pollution and climate change. Essentially, it's a reflection of our sort of modern way of life, if you like. And we've sort of become acclimatized to this, and it influences how we perceive and define the natural world around us, that sort of shifting baseline syndrome that I talked about. So whilst we like to think in the UK we live in a green and pleasant land, and we do obviously have lots of natural wonders, it is a land that is under extreme stress. And in most cases, it's not necessarily land that's managed for nature's benefit. And that's really reflected in the statistics about the UK being in the bottom 10% for countries with intact biodiversity. So these statistics are telling a story, and it's the ecological emergency playing out in our backyard. And we all know that climate change is a big challenge, but arguably the biodiversity emergency is even bigger, and nature quietly goes about doing a lot of heavy lifting for us. And we even have a name for it. We call them ecosystem services. And we've in the UK we've quantified some of its benefits in monetary terms, and I've put some statistics on the slide. The annual value of ecosystem services to the UK economy are estimated to be about £47 billion a year. And that's made up of services such as water provisioning, removing air pollutants, and urban heat regulation. And some of the biggest benefits for people are on health, not just in terms of things like air pollution and heat regulation, but in being able to visit and spend time in the natural environment or in green open spaces. And in its natural capital accounts, the UK government estimates that the combined aesthetic and recreational value of nature in the UK is worth in the region of about £4 billion. And the health benefits from recreation was one of the largest contributors to the total asset value of our ecosystem services. And one statistic I recently came across through the natural capital accounts was that the total asset value of ecosystem services in the UK, and that's estimated at £1.5 trillion. Now that's comparable to UK stock market capitalisation, which is around £2 trillion. So you can sort of get a sense of the value that the value of the ecosystem services and nature around us provides. So I said earlier that green infrastructure is critical infrastructure, and this is kind of what I meant by that. And nature doing a lot of heavy lifting for us. And we think of other critical infrastructure such as power, transport, and water networks. This is infrastructure that defines the modern world, and we need to think of green infrastructure and nature as being part of that sort of critical infrastructure. If there was a power cut, we expect it to be restored in a matter of hours. But imagine if the power started going out in places and never came back on. And that's kind of the danger that we're facing from a nature perspective. Nature's lights are gradually going out, and the effects will become more and more obvious through things like our health, through water quality, and through access to the natural world. And another piece of research that really drives home this message was in Oxfordshire, where the County Council commissioned a report about 4 years ago, I think it was, looking at the case for investment in green infrastructure. And the study looked at the cost of some of the more significant environmental and social challenges that the county faced, from things like treating the effects of mental health and air pollution to traffic congestion and inactive lifestyles. And they estimated the cost of managing those challenges was about £2.5 billion a year. Now, Oxfordshire's economy is worth about £25 billion a year. So £2.5 billion spent on managing these challenges is like a 10% handbrake on economic productivity in one county alone. And the study went on to estimate that for each pound that they invested or could invest in green infrastructure produced about £4 of benefits over 30 years. So the economic benefits that result from the presence of good green infrastructure is more than a match for the cost of treating the impacts because of its absence. And quite simply, if we don't have enough green infrastructure and the GI we do have is in poor state, then the benefits we receive from those free services becomes less and less, and we start having to pay for the impact and the effects of that more and more. So strategically, the environmental, economic, social case for green infrastructure stacks up. And that really brings me on to the built environment and building with nature. So good green infrastructure is that which works for people as well as nature, but too often we manage and develop land in a way that isn't really working as well as it could for either. And it misses the opportunities and benefits that it can deliver. For example, the aesthetic value provided by a view of a green or blue space, along with recreational value, is estimated to be worth about £4 billion in the UK. Yet often the way in which we plan, design, and build our places doesn't recognise this value. And thinking back to what I was saying earlier about green infrastructure being critical infrastructure, you wouldn't buy a house that didn't have electricity or running water. But quite often, particularly in the UK, we make such compromises when it comes to green infrastructure assets and functions. And as a result, particularly in newer developments, too many of us are living in less healthier and resilient places. And research by the New Economics Foundation in 2022 found that neighbourhood green space provision has declined by 1/3 in 21st century developments. And that has resulted in 9 million fewer trips to green space every year. So if you're living in a neighbourhood that's been built after the millennium in the UK, your local park is likely to be smaller and you're likely to have to travel further to reach it. But not only that, new housing tends to have smaller gardens and poorer connectivity to surrounding areas and lacks space and priority for people, particularly young people. And so you have to start asking yourself, who or what are we building for if it's not people, because it's not nature. And we all know that an ingredient of a strong community is a sense of pride in place, but too often we give too much of our places over to roads, parking, and in some cases quite indistinctive, housing. And the image just in the top left of this slide is a housing estate that was built in 2010, and it featured in a national audit by University College London School of Planning a few years ago. And the local architect involved in that study said that the cumulative effects of all the design flaws and the isolation of the estate make it a miserable place to try and exist. And that's quite a damning indictment of a modern housing development. And the study concluded that the design of new housing developments is overwhelmingly mediocre or poor, with less affluent communities often being the worst affected by that. So we are building houses, but not always building places that can foster and sustain a sense of community, let alone be good for nature. And the chair of the Place Alliance in the UK, who led that research, said that the high quality design makes new residential development more acceptable to local communities, and it delivers high social, economic, and environmental value to all. So the right approach can improve places and deliver benefits for people, wildlife, and planet. And that's really where building with nature starts to come in, and the work that we do. So moving on to building with nature. Building with Nature traces its origins back to 2015, where it started life as an idea in Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust. And for those of you not familiar with the Wildlife Trust movement, they're a federation of 46 independent wildlife conservation charities covering the UK. And their purpose is to bring back wildlife back and empower people to take meaningful action for nature. And when it comes to new development in their region, wildlife trusts often find themselves fighting nature's corner. And back in 2015, colleagues from the Wildlife Trust in Gloucestershire wanted to find a way to encourage new development, to take more proactive steps to protect and enhance and create new habitat for the benefit of wildlife and people. So they recognised that there was a gap in defining how to do that, and they sought funding from Innovate UK to develop, do some research and develop best practice standards for the provision of green infrastructure, and they worked in collaboration with the University of West of England to do that. And the output of that project was the Building with Nature standards. But to avoid those outputs sitting on a shelf somewhere gathering dust, in 2018 they founded a new organisation called Building with Nature, with the aim of taking those standards that they developed and making them useful for planners, developers, and asset owners. And so essentially a benchmark, a standard was born and a benchmark was born. And in essence, that's what Building with Nature is. It's a benchmark for good green infrastructure. So why do we need a benchmark and standards? Well, fundamentally, it's about supporting clients and stakeholders who want to build better places for all the reasons I've touched on. And when we started out, there was really little to define and showcase what good holistic green infrastructure looked like. So there was a need there for that. And we wanted to offer a tool to help planners integrate green infrastructure approaches into their strategic policies and supplementary guidance, but also support clients and design teams and project teams in their response to things like policy-driven planning requirements, but also more widely the climate and ecological emergencies. And as we see it at its most extreme, through some of the examples I've shown on the slides, the planning and delivery of new housing development is failing to deliver those full benefits for people and nature. So we made it our mission to address that by creating a benchmark and a movement that holds up and celebrates the kind of places that we would all want to work in and live in. So at its core, Building with Nature is a benchmark, and that benchmark is embodied within what we call the standards framework. And that framework draws from evidence and good practice guidance to define high quality green infrastructure at each stage of the development process. So it goes from planning and design through to construction and long-term management and maintenance. And the framework that we have is overseen by a standards board, which is comprised of representatives from professional bodies in the UK, experts in green infrastructure, and industry and government representation as well. And the standards board, in collaboration with ourselves, review and update the standards in response to things like new planning legislation, for example, and changes in the development sector. So the standards framework is routinely updated every few years to ensure it remains fit for purpose. And then alongside the standards, we operate third-party certification, which enables that independent recognition of whether it's policy or new development itself. And that can be commercial, residential, or green infrastructure led, but to ensure that it's providing that recognition. And we issue Building with Nature awards. So for those that use it, can demonstrate robustly that they're meeting the standards. And you can see some examples on the screen of development and green infrastructure initiatives that have used the standards and achieved a Building with Nature award. And the awards are a key part of achieving our mission, as they provide the verification of green infrastructure claims, but also, and arguably more importantly, they showcase to others what is possible, and in doing so raise the bar for good green infrastructure. So I want to take a bit of a shallow dive into the standards themselves to give you an insight into how we define good green infrastructure in Building with Nature. And I should add from the start, most of it is not rocket science, but it's a rather common sense framework for defining what good GI is and what it looks like and what it should address. And we have 12 individual standards in building with nature, and they're arranged into these four themes of core, well-being, water, and wildlife. And the first thing to say is the standards themselves are principle-led. They're not overly prescriptive. They recognise that context from a site and locality perspective is key. So a green infrastructure solution or approach that's appropriate for a tight urban site will obviously differ in scale and approach from that which works best on the edge of town or on a more rural brownfield site. And all of the standards and the four themes are interlinked and they're complementary. So there is some overlap across the standards, and that's the nature and advantage of green infrastructure. It is multifunctional, and one GI asset has multiple functions and benefits, and that's reflected in how the standards interrelate and talk to each other. I'll talk a little bit about accreditation later as well, but any development or policy looking to achieve a Building with Nature award has to meet all 12 of the Building with Nature standards. Remember, this is a definition of good green infrastructure, and we obviously want to encourage and recognise that. So there's no trade-offs when it comes to achieving the benchmark. A development with good GI has to meet all of these individual standards. So let's just take a look at each in turn. So in terms of the core standards, there are 6 core standards, and together they distinguish green infrastructure from a more conventional approach to the design and delivery of open and green space. And as a key principle of green infrastructure, multifunctionality and connectivity recognise that GI can fulfil a wide range of functions and diverse benefits for both people and nature. So the first standard aims to promote green infrastructure that forms and contributes to an optimal multifunctional network within the development and wider area, and contributing towards the restoration, the creation and enhancement of those networks to achieve benefits for people and wildlife. And the purpose of the second core standard is to minimise the vulnerability and exposure of green infrastructure and the development as a whole to wider climate-related hazards and impacts, and ensure that it's maximising opportunities to contribute to things like net zero carbon goals and nature recovery. And one way to achieve that is through the assessment of climate risk to the site, and then prioritising green infrastructure solutions that mitigate those risks and their impact without contributing to them further. And in doing so, green infrastructure and the people and wildlife that rely on it can be more resilient and adapted to climate change, and obviously positively contribute to low or zero carbon living. Maximising environmental net gains is there to ensure development uses green infrastructure to help mitigate any unavoidable residual harms to the local environment resulting from development in that location. And that's particularly from things like sources of air or noise pollution or soil degradation. And as with all standards, the purpose here is to secure benefits that go beyond statutory minimums and encourage greater enhancement of the local environment for people and wildlife, which in turn then helps promote individual and community well-being, social cohesion, and obviously supports wildlife. And standard 4 is about ensuring from the outset that the project team and the development's green infrastructure features take account of and is shaped by existing local policy and the physical landscape and community priorities. And in doing that, the development's GI could contribute to delivering the aims of the local context and its strategic objectives, particularly those relating to things like ecological constraints and opportunities, and social and cultural benefits of green infrastructure. And the design of GI alongside any built form is integral to the creation of a great place, and it can be used to really reinforce the distinctiveness of the local area, and place distinctiveness can add to the vitality of a place, which in turn impacts positively on people feeling a sense of belonging and pride in where they live, and those attributes can contribute directly to people's health and well-being. And furthermore, the quality of the spaces around and the relationship with the built environment is as important as the buildings themselves, yet the potential for GI is not always realised, and often this is to the detriment of good placemaking and communities as well as the natural environment. So standard 5 creates distinctive places, aims to address that and ask the question, how does green infrastructure design and its features combine alongside built forms to create that place distinctiveness. And then the final core standard focuses on ensuring early and effective planning and implementation of management and maintenance of green infrastructure. And that's critical if you want to secure the functions and benefits of green infrastructure for what they're valued for. There are often examples of meaningful design visions and good green infrastructure which are not always effectively implemented in operation. To be effective, good green infrastructure needs to be appropriately monitored, managed and maintained from day one and for many years thereafter. So moving on, the wellbeing, water and wildlife standards build on that foundation that the core standards are seeking to address. And these are aspects that are often inadequately considered when designing and procuring new development. And we saw from some of the placemaking examples I showed earlier that often green spaces are not close to where people live and work, or if they are, they're not designed to optimize use and enjoyment for everyone across the year, or if they're not very good and also not very good at promoting active living as well. And too often we see green spaces in existing development that are no-go areas for some people and cultures, and that's to the detriment of social cohesion and individuals' health and well-being as well. So standards, the wellbeing standards, standards 7 and 8, seek to address that by ensuring an appropriate range of green infrastructure features and spaces are provided for the scale, type and locality of a development, and that those spaces are accessible, they're welcoming and safe, with features that emphasise seasonal differences, stimulate interest for people and really promote year-round use. So they embrace the changing seasons. But also in designing those spaces, seek to ensure that the project team considers the socio-demographic composition of existing or planned for communities, and that the green infrastructure is responding to those needs and strengths. I've seen examples of projects that haven't done that as well as they could have, and they really miss an opportunity to create a better place for people that they're designing for. The water standards, or quite often referred to as blue infrastructure, this is another one of the cornerstones of good green infrastructure. In England, we've lost 90% of our wetlands over the last few hundred years, and that's having a huge impact on biodiversity and wildlife. And globally, wetlands are disappearing 3 times faster than forests. So wetlands are one of the Earth's most threatened ecosystems, and this loss doesn't just reflect or affect wildlife. Historically, wetlands are interwoven into our culture and livelihoods and folklore, with many, certainly in the UK, many place names and customs derived from wetland habitats or species. And tackling this problem, on some sense, it requires a strategic approach and solution, but new development can play a vital role in that. And often the approach to water management in development is to bury it underground and out of sight. But through the water standards of building with nature, what we're aiming to do is encourage green infrastructure solutions and development in general that embrace more above ground management of water and mimic more natural approaches to the catchment and flow of water onto and off sites. And there are so many different types of systems and GI components that new development can embrace, which not only help manage that flow and the treatment of water and also help manage flood risk, but also bring social and well-being benefits of water closer to people, as well as benefits for wildlife, and create new stepping stone habitats in the landscape where previously they used to exist, but were taken out. And that's really the focus of the water standards and what we look for in building with nature. And then when it comes to wildlife, historically, we know that new development has not on the whole been good for nature, and that's been borne out by the statistics on habitat loss and species decline that I showed earlier. However, it doesn't have to be that way. And when it comes to nature in the built environment, I do subscribe to the consensus that new development through the use of green infrastructure can be a catalyst for delivering biodiversity and wildlife gains, particularly in landscapes and sites that are devoid of natural or habitat-friendly features. There's real opportunity there to put that back in. And in fact, it's vital that all new development sort of plays its part in mitigating its own impact and contributing positively and proportionately to nature's recovery. We shouldn't be and simply can't afford to create new places that ignore that. So not surprisingly, the focus of the wildlife standards is about putting nature at the heart of development and aiding nature's recovery, as well as realizing the economic and well-being benefits from pursuing nature-based solutions. So when it comes to the application, its application, Building with Nature looks for green infrastructure that delivers wildlife by following the mitigation hierarchy and paying particular attention to what's existing as well as what's possible, both on the site but also in the immediate landscape and locality. And they also seek the use of integrated built-in means of green infrastructure. So, for example, one simple example is swift bricks in the UK, which are a form of integrated nesting box for birds. And the population of swifts in the UK has declined massively in the past few decades. And one cause of that loss is the traditional nesting sites in buildings. So there's an opportunity to put them back, and whilst we're at it, let's put some more habitat type that attracts the types of insects that swifts feed off, and through fairly simple interventions, we can have quite a big impact for quite a significant species. So when it comes to wildlife enhancement and underpinning nature's recovery, all projects can play a role, and obviously the scale and quantum of green infrastructure solutions will vary by site. But all projects can use GI approaches and solutions. So on a larger scale, they help to sort of reconnect habitat in a more strategic sense. Or on a smaller scale, they become an important sort of stepping stone for wildlife in the landscape. So gradually over time, we recreate that connectivity, and we start putting some of those functions back in. And it's these kind of green infrastructure solutions that Build with Nature standards seek to encourage, and obviously we look for in determining whether a development can be classed as meeting our definition of good green infrastructure. So that's a quick whistle-stop tour through the standards. I mentioned earlier that one reason for a benchmark was to showcase what good GI looks like, and it's important to sort of hold up and celebrate those developments and clients and design teams that are getting it right and raising that bar of good practice. So at the heart of what we do is assurance and providing that verification of good GI. So as well as the framework of standards, which stakeholders can freely download and use as best practice guidance, Build with Nature is also an assessment and third-party certification scheme. And the assessments are carried out by trained professionals. We train and approve assessors, many of whom are landscape architects, or they're ecologists or environmental consultants, and often they'll be part of the project team for the project that's applying Building with Nature. And they can assess, and Building with Nature can assess either development, but also policy documents as well. So it can be applied to individual sites and developments, large and small, but also the approaches and through policy. And we at Sintali, our role is obviously with standard owners and operators, but we also audit and certify those assessments. And policy or development that meet the standards are granted a certificated award. And you can see on the screen that's our current sort of badge of recognition. And there are different types of award depending on the type of assessment and stage in the planning and development life cycle that the standards are used at. And since inception, we've issued over 60 awards, and the majority of those have been for new development with a mix of residential, commercial, infrastructure, and open space applications. We currently have a number of projects and policies that are going through and working towards an award, and many more expressing an interest in using Building with Nature. And there are over 220 trained and approved assessors across the UK now. And this slide just highlights some of the organisations in both the private and public sector who have used BWN or are using Building with Nature and sought an award. So Building with Nature is still relatively young and new, and our impact is small, but it is growing. And why do clients use Building with Nature? There are probably a number of answers to that question. For some, it's driven through local planning policy, whilst for others it can help define and communicate that positive narrative about their approach to green infrastructure to planners, but also increasingly to their customers or to their future tenants. And I would say that a building with nature awarded development is a more resilient development. It's a healthier place for people, and it's demonstrated an approach that has considered both the climate and ecological emergencies. And ultimately, building with nature helps its users manage risk, whether that risk is related to planning, whether it's asset value, physical impacts, or reputational. And in terms of project teams and designers, it really supports what they're already striving to do, which is create great places. So it's a supporter of that principle. So it's a useful tool to help do that. So I just wanted to touch on to end the presentation, a few sort of case study examples and of projects that we've been involved with. Now, this isn't a project that's achieved a Building with Nature award. This is an image of a motorway service station in England, and it might look familiar to some of you if you've ever used. I think this is on the this is Toddington, which I think is on the M1. On initial glance, it looks fairly functional, but what I see is a plethora of signage, tarmac, metal and glass, and there's very little green infrastructure. And perhaps not much thought has gone into how design can be good for nature here, or even the people that are using the facility. So it's not a place that I would find inviting. And when I have to use this type of motorway service station, I tend to sort of want to get in and out as quickly as possible. But this, on the other hand, is much more inviting. This is Gloucester Services on the M5, and it opened about 10 years ago, and it was retrospectively assessed using Building with Nature standards when they were first produced. And it's worth saying this was initially a controversial development when it was first proposed, because it sits between a country park and the edge of the Cotswold National Landscape. So a traditional approach to service station design wasn't going to cut it. And the ambition was therefore to use green infrastructure to maximise the effect, to have minimal impact on its surroundings, reflect the sensitivity of the wider environment, and contribute to more of a unique sense of place. And here's just a few more images. And the client and their design team achieved that by things like green roof. There's over 4,000 metre squares of green roofs on this development, and they planted over 100 trees. And they also introduced sustainable drainage features to provide wildlife habitat and manage surface water runoff within the boundary of the site. And those ponds are now home to new species on site. And they also included things like bat boxes and raptor boxes for kestrels. And they've got Cotswold stonewall cladding, so that provides a habitat for many insects. And whilst this development was assessed using the Building with Nature standards retrospectively, the client said of the process that it helped them to refine the plans for enhancing the wetland habitats and identify improvements to their long-term management and maintenance plan. And this is a satellite image of the two service stations. Gloucester's on the right and Toddington on the left. And it's not necessarily so obvious through the satellite image, but I've stood on a hill overlooking Gloucester Services, and you can really appreciate the difference that the green infrastructure brings in terms of blending the development with its surrounding landscape. In the image on the right, it may be hard to make out, but where the buildings are, but the service station, the main service station, is just on the sort of south of the boundary of the site. And then there's a separate filling station, and both have got green roofs, so it's really hard to make them out. Whereas in the Toddington one, it's more of a sea of grey. So yeah, two examples there of different solutions to the same function. That one that's embraced and used green infrastructure to create a more inviting and better development from a nature and people perspective. Second case study I want to show, this is a redevelopment of an existing estate. This estate is called Barn Barton. It's in Plymouth, and it used to be part of Britain's largest naval estate. And as you can see, its style reflects a sort of mid-century approach to mass housing. It's got quite a lot of green space in it, a lot of open space, and some established green infrastructure. And until its recent demolition, it retained quite a strong sense of community. But the estate itself became dated. The buildings had suffered really from a lack of investment over time, and some of the housing, the external spaces, are not very accessible or inviting, as you can probably appreciate from some of the photos. but now the site is being transformed into social housing by Clarion Housing in the UK in an extensive redevelopment. And their design proposals were heavily influenced by the existing community to ensure that the project reflects their strengths and needs, and retains existing assets, but also brings in new ones to enhance the environment, particularly through the use of green infrastructure. And one of those key changes is a green street which runs through the heart of the development, tying the community in with nature, and it also serves as a green link into an existing woodland. And the proposals seek to relegate some of the parking and roads away from the heart of the development to help foster that sort of sense of a safer place for residents, and particularly children as well. And the new layout also frees up views of the Tamar Estuary. This whole site overlooks the Tamar Estuary, and a lot of the way the existing buildings were positioned didn't make best use of that. So this helps to maintain that sort of community naval links and heritage, and also from a blue infrastructure point of view, brings people closer to water as well. And Barton used the Building with Nature standards throughout its design, and it's heavily influenced the proposals for the green infrastructure strategy. And the development isn't complete yet, which is why you're only sort of seeing computer generated images on the slide. But once it is, the intention will be to go back and visit the site and verify its compliance with Building with Nature standards, and then we can give it the Building with Nature award post construction. Once we can verify that. So if you want to know more about Barton and any of the Building with Nature projects that we've awarded, there are a number of case studies on our website, and we do list all the projects that we've awarded as well on the Building with Nature website. We also you can download the standards framework freely from the website if you want to know more about what's involved with the standards that I introduced, or if you're interested in becoming a Building with Nature assessor, we do run regular training courses. But yeah, otherwise, thank you for listening, and I think we've got about 10 minutes left for any questions.
Thank you so much for that, Tim. Yeah, really useful sort of insights and a summary of the standard. So I'd like to invite the participants now, if you do have any questions, to write in either the chat or the Q&A box. I'll give you a second. And if there's anything outstanding, you can always email us after the session as well. I'll give you one more minute. So we've got one question here. Have any developments outside of the UK been awarded? Tim, over to you.
Not to date, no. The focus has been on applying Building with Nature within the UK, but it's certainly something we're interested in and looking how can we take what we do and our experience and lessons with applying Building with Nature and using it outside the UK. But no, to date, the focus has been on UK development.
And there's a similar one. Has this been initiated in a tropical setting? So UK is not quite tropical yet.
yeah. I'm looking forward to the day that we can do that, but no, unfortunately, not yet.
Another question then, is there a process of de-accreditation if places don't follow through on maintenance of a project?
I guess the answer to that is kind of yes. So we give the awards are very clear on the stages in which they apply. So we have things like design award, and one of the things we do is post construction. we'll go back and look at the development and make sure that the green infrastructure that was proposed, because during design it's just promises on paper, but we go back and check that, okay, well, has the project delivered that green infrastructure in accordance with what they promised or what they proposed? And we, in some sense, we wouldn't necessarily strip out or take away a design award, but we wouldn't give it the final step in that award process. So yeah, in some sense, we come at it from, obviously we want to encourage people to go through the process and to deliver those outputs. So if they hadn't done that, they just simply wouldn't be eligible for the award for that stage in the process. Build with nature is predominantly applied on new development. I think when it comes to existing development and using it more in terms of that, if you like, that stewardship space of green infrastructure, then I think you'd start to see using accreditation more in a cyclical sense. So in order to be able to maintain the award, that would be subject to ongoing checks and verifications. So again, and in that sense, yeah, there would kind of be a de-accreditation, to use your term, because they'd no longer be eligible for the award if they couldn't demonstrate the ongoing compliance.
Brilliant. Another question then. The new PM pledged to building new homes on grey belt. What's your thoughts about the proposal?
Well, I think we need to understand what the definition of grey belt is first and foremost. I think generally speaking, and what's hopefully come across today is I do believe development can be a catalyst for doing things differently, and we've got a choice now. Do we build 1.5 million homes that are poor quality with lacking green space, that don't reflect the broader landscapes in which they're in, or do we do something better? And I think what's important, that goes alongside obviously the numbers, is the quality side of what's being proposed. And we do audit developments when we've seen developments on edge of town in essence in greenfield spaces, and there's a right way and a wrong way to do it. So I think, yeah, obviously we should be targeting new housing in informally developed sites, but even some brownfield sites are quite diverse from a nature perspective. So, from a green infrastructure perspective, yeah, it's not quite as simple as building on grey belt land. I think whether it's grey, whether it's green, whether it's in the middle of a city, what are the opportunities, what are the restraints for doing something that's better than is already there, and really supporting some of those more, I guess, strategic aims and objectives in terms of nature recovery.
Brilliant. Yeah, it will be interesting to see the plans in action as we move forward. So another one then for you, Tim. So thanks for the session. I fully agree with the principles. I understand that feasibility is a consideration because people need to be paid. But in a critical situation, do you think that GI should ever be considered unfeasible?
I think there's always something you can do from a GI perspective, and the Build with Nature standards. One of the reasons they're more qualitative rather than, if you like, metric based, is to reflect the opportunities that are available for a site. So if you're in a tight urban site, what you can do from a GI perspective is going to be different than if you're, a 1,000 home development on the edge of town, or on a greenfield site. I think it's different scales and types of solutions. But yeah, I think ultimately it comes down to building places the right way, and building homes and places where people want to live and work, and that's benefits them, and in the process nature as well. So I think it's a challenge. We obviously obviously people need new homes, but there is a right way and a wrong way to go about doing that. And I think there are opportunities there to certainly in the UK to do things a bit better.
Brilliant. And then they're all coming in now. So another question for you.
That's good.
How do you see this supporting biodiversity net gain?
Yeah, I mean, I think building with nature and BNG are complementary. Biodiversity net gain feeds into what I was talking about in terms of, development being an opportunity to put something back and do something better. So yeah, I mean, I guess if you come at this from point of view, is the human race isn't going anywhere, so we're going to be building, we're going to be redeveloping, and that's going to bring its challenges, in terms of land use, in terms of space, and impact on wildlife. So let's use the tools and the metrics we have at our disposal to ensure that the development we do has a positive and not a negative impact on biodiversity. So BNG, it overlaps and it supports what we're doing with nature. Obviously, wildlife is one aspect of what we cover in building with nature. We also focus on the people side as well. But yeah, it all helps underpin and support what we're trying to achieve, and the mission of really sort of defining what good green infrastructure looks like, and finding ways of delivering it.
Brilliant. So that is the last question that we've got come through. So thank you. Oh, yeah, thank you again so much, Tim, for hosting the session today. Really excited to see more building with nature projects, working with Sintali throughout the UK, and fingers crossed beyond soon. As I mentioned before, recording and slides will be sent out to participants, and do go check out the other events that are being hosted by Net Zero Week. Have a good rest of your day, and take care. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for tuning in.
Bye bye.